Hello, and welcome. Good morning. I'm Nick Robinson. I'm the chair of the Librarians Association of Berkeley, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the spring program of the LAUC-B Committee on Professional Development. And I want to thank the committee members who conceived and organized this morning's program. Co-chairs Dana Jemison and Teresa Mora, and committee members Randall Brandt, Hillary Schiraldi, and Harrison Decker. Is this loud enough? You all can hear me, can you? I also want to thank the Magnes collection of Jewish art and life since 2010. I'm part of the Bancroft Library for making available this meeting space in their lovely new home. A couple of housekeeping things. Food and drink are permitted only in this room. So when you walk out, please leave your cups and any food. There are restrooms on your way out on the right before you get to the door. Our program this morning is titled Library Leaders' Perspectives on Professional Development. The committee has recruited a distinguished panel of library leaders and asked them to consider the following questions. What trends do you foresee for UC libraries? What skills and attributes will UC librarians need to effectively address these trends so they can meet the diverse and sometimes conflicting needs of our constituents? As UC libraries re-envision, reassess, and regroup, your perspectives as library leaders will help LAUC to ensure that our members have a good understanding of our future landscape and what will be needed to negotiate it successfully. The format of today's program is as follows. During the first hour, each of our panelists will speak in response to the general topic of the program. I'll introduce each of them in turn. Unfortunately, Denise Stevens is ill today and won't be able to make it to our program, but that'll give us a little bit more time for questions and discussion. Following their presentations, I'll ask the panel some questions that the committee has solicited from our members and provided in advance. And then we'll have time for questions from you. You may have noticed next to the sign-in sheet, which I've been asked to remind you to please sign. So it could be a sign-out sheet if you didn't sign on your way in. Next to that, there's some index cards, and so there'll be a couple people who will collect those cards. So at any time, you can jot down a question, and after our scripted questions, I'll read as many of your questions as time permits. Okay, so let's start. So I'm going to first introduce Tom Leonard. Tom Leonard, as I think you all know, is University Librarian at UC Berkeley. Tom has served as University Librarian since 2001. He's a professor in the Graduate School of Journalism, where he also served as Associate Dean for more than a decade. As University Librarian, Tom manages the Doe Moffett, Bancroft East Asian Library, as well as 15 subject specialty libraries. And so, without further ado, Tom, welcome. Please join me in welcoming Tom.
Thank you, Nick. This has been kind of a rough week of communication between the University Librarian and LAUC leadership. They were in my office earlier, a couple days ago, last week, and my cell phone rang, and I said, well, maybe I should look at that. And it was a call from somewhere on the peninsula, actually Monterey Bay area. And I said, I better find what's going on. And I listened, and the person on the phone, this is Mary, and I thought she was saying, we want to sell you a suite of furniture. And I hung up on her, and then the conversation with the LAUC leadership went to, junk calls, how we're irritated, communication systems we can't control. Until 10 minutes later, my wife called me back, saying that was the alarm company, you idiot. You need to go home and put your people on. So I did, everything was fine except the phone call. So I literally ran out, walked out of the LAUC leadership. So we'll try for this week, will be better. I have something to give you, and it's not a pop quiz. document, which has another piece of data on the other side, will come into my discussion in a minute. Responsive to the questions that, or at least the theme that LAUC has articulated, it seems to me that the simple, distinctive mark of a professional is that we give people we serve what they should have, not necessarily what they say they want. It is just as important to point out that professionals try and treat everyone as partners, partners in a common pursuit, not rivals to be thwarted. The lesson to be drawn from the first point is that librarians have to be career-long learners, not simply perpetuators of craft skills. They need to know best practices, of course, but also when it is time to change those practices. The lesson to be learned from the second point is that librarians need to be super citizens. The handout suggests why this is so at Berkeley in particular, and all research libraries in general. So the Woodsman Graph is something I took away from a Council of Deans meeting. I won't trouble you with the detail of why there are two bars of different colors. The point, of course, is that when you look at how professionals get into trouble, how Berkeley gets into trouble, it's quite interesting what motivates people to go to the Ombudsman's office. If you'd asked me, I would have said workload issues, especially these days, discrimination, still with us, would be prime movers of people to end up in the Ombudsman's office. And I was quite enlightened by the finding that for many different kinds of units on this campus, it is not the simple, but it is the fundamental question of respect and civility. On the other side, an unscientific but perhaps revealing poll with a bunch of ULs sitting in a hotel being asked what their job is like and how they overcome difficulties. And you will see at this moment who they thought really was the hardest to mobilize and to inspire. How we treat one another is the surest indicator of static and stress that will place our governance in someone else's hands and eat up our time to accomplish anything. Recognize also that internal constraints, not outside forces, may be the biggest obstacles to change. Professional development, to get to the core of why we're here, means getting really good at both challenges. So I would put this in even simpler terms, recognizing and conquering new fields as they appear, and staying a mensch. I choose the word because of where we were meeting. Understanding that the Yiddish is now gender-free, as indeed the Swedish Ombudsman is gender-free. I can't hope to translate this into the very job assignments you have, the very different libraries you represent. But I can share suggestions that come from a briefing paper that ARL published last month on the subject of collections, which concern us all. This is the task force on 20th century collections. I was the co-chair, along with Deborah Jacobs, the University Librarian at Duke, and the proud holder of a Berkeley Library degree. What we said in this brief document, extracting a few of the sentences, I think is responsive to the notion of professional development that I've tried to set up here. Collections management is now a juggling act with the 3 plates to be kept spinning labeled local needs, shared investments, and coordinated decisions. When we wrote that, I was actually thinking of the kind of scratchy black and white video that people like Gary Handman still have, showing you know, entertainment programming of the 50s and 60s, and there was always a juggler with plates. That, I think, is a challenge of professional development for librarians who come anywhere near collection. Local needs, shared investments, coordinated decisions. Those plates have to be kept spinning. The briefing paper spells out some aspects of this. The enduring need within the library for deep subject expertise will increasingly be met by teamwork and cross-institutional partnerships in the 21st century as we look ahead. Winning collections in the context of collective agreements, shared off-site shelving, and coordinated print retention will become common in libraries of all sizes. In an effort to increase efficiencies in expenditure, some libraries will move from collecting material in anticipation of its use to resource management that is more directly responsive to express explicit user needs. Digital preservation and archiving will be accepted as an integral component of publishing agreements. Librarians and other customers of electronic publishers will insist on the long-term retention of published content. Never before have we been required to grasp so many dimensions of research in order to make wise decisions. In a network world, local collections as ends in themselves make learning fragmentary and incomplete. 21st century collection management will therefore require increased collaboration within and among institutions. The potential of the wealth of resources will only be realized through coordinated and effective advocacy, discovery, and creativity by research library staff. This then, according to this task force, amounts to the right stuff, the skills, outlooks, areas for development that librarians will need to show as we face 21st century challenges. And so that's a part of my answer to the call to this meeting. There are other things that we could look at, and may have looked at, and that we could discuss. I would say a criticism of the task force I was on is that it wasn't revolutionary enough or willing to dispense with old models quite freely enough. But if your taste goes for more transformative or almost to the point of science fiction, then you will instead be fans of the ARL 2030 scenarios, which talk about a complete transformation in higher education. The center cannot hold, things spin apart, research universities are in some ways unrecognizable, and the library professionals find a niche in these scenarios. If your taste for change isn't quite that advanced, you might want to actually take a look at some very brief statements that have been published by Berkeley's Center for the Study of Higher Education that bring the question of change down to the campus level. This is the so-called notion of devolution. Laine will forgive me, of shaking up everything in Oakland and having some of the parks land on campuses. And to date, these brief statements are views at a very high altitude and don't come down to the level of how our library should work and whether there's any more devolution in the way libraries work. But one could certainly take that up as an interesting part of the conversation. Well, you you have recently enough heard me talk about another source of new thinking about the role of librarians in professional development, the excellent work of the task force on the role of the librarian that was part of the re-envisioning process. There are authors of that particular, or team members of that report here. But since that was sort of discussed somewhat at an early bird in the end of April, I'm certainly open to questions about that. But let me just remind you where we are in that process. The survey that Cliff was telling me before we started, he took, so he's one of the more than 3,000 data points that we have. That just closed. None of us have looked or have been able to see the results, so we don't know anything more about what our users are going to say than we did a month ago. But it sure will be interesting to find out, and I'm sure some of their answers will bear on the question of professional development that we're here to discuss today. So I'm going to pass the podium to Laine Farley, as Nick will explain.
I'll make that little introduction. Thank you, Tom. I hope everything was okay at home when you got
Yes,
it was fine. No, so thank you, Tom. And our next speaker will be Laine Farley. Laine is the executive director of the California Digital Library, and she's been with CDL since its inception in 1997, and assumed the position of executive director in 2008. Previous to that, her roles at CDL have included positions as the Director of Digital Library Services and the Deputy University Librarian. In addition, she was the User Services Coordinator and the Coordinator of Bibliographic Policy and Services at the UC Division of Library Automation, a place that we'll hear mentioned again. She has also been a reference librarian and a coordinator of bibliographic instruction at UC Riverside. And the head of the Humanities Department at the Steen Library at Stephen F. Austin State University, which I now know is in Texas, kind of towards Louisiana. So please join me in welcoming Laine. Oh.
Okay.
Is that going to work?
I think so. Sound check. That's okay. Okay. Well, I decided to take a little bit of a different approach to trying to answer this question. I'm certainly not one to attempt to predict the future. It just never works. So I thought it would be interesting. We were fortunate at CDL to have hired two people recently, two young women who were not librarians. They both have PhDs, one in comparative literature, and she's worked on some digital humanities projects, and her dissertation, in fact, had a digital component. And the second person is a scientist. She studied at Woods Hole. We met her through the Data One project, that is one of the NSF DataNet initiatives. And she's been involved in data curation, which is one of the focuses of that big grant project. So I wanted to get their opinions on what's going on with researchers nowadays from their different disciplinary perspectives, and how librarians might be better positioned to fit in with and to assist with what's going on. So I asked them, first of all, what are some of the challenges to researchers in your area? And the humanities person said that when she first started working on digital humanities, it was really lack of institutional support. You know, the cutting edge of research was just simply not recognized within the institution in terms of offering courses or assistance in any way. And that is now starting to change. There are courses emerging. There are humanities centers. UC has several, actually, and was pretty early on in establishing that kind of support. And the funding is starting to, be there in some modest ways. And she said that the other thing was that as researchers started down this path in digital humanities, they needed some just basic training on data management. She used that phrase. So data management in the humanities is equal course, her core emphasis has been on data management, and that the challenge there is that researchers don't really want to have to think about it. They want to do science. They don't want to think about software and ontologies and preservation and metadata and all of those things. So what are the incentives to convince them that it's worth their time to really figure out how to do this as the core part of what their work is all about nowadays? So then I asked them both, well, what can libraries do to make things easier? And the humanities person went back to two aspects. She talked about databases as being sort of a fundamental tool that she had to work with throughout her career, and understanding metadata and taxonomies and all of that sort of thing. And then the other thing she mentioned is preservation. And she said libraries have a rich history in thinking about preservation. They know what has to be considered, and so that perspective needs to be brought in as we work on these new kinds of research fronts. The science person said, well, scientists don't need help finding things anymore. They don't even think of going to the library to find materials. They're swimming in it. And of course we know they haven't found everything, but nonetheless that's not the main thing on their minds. That really the focus is on managing and archiving their work. And she was really keen on this notion of librarians becoming kind of the guides and the shepherds of the process of doing research. So helping shape the practices and the approaches that scientists use as they're beginning their work and trying to manage it throughout the process. She talked about things like helping identify repositories and metadata standards, and in particular to get involved at the beginning of the project. Really assert that you can help them navigate all of these things, and they don't realize that librarians can do these kinds of things. So then I asked the two of them, what's your impression of librarians and their awareness of these kinds of issues and their willingness to work with researchers in these ways? Well, that got a little bit more disturbing. The humanities person said that she had worked with she was in comparative literature, and there was a librarian assigned to their department, and that person was quite helpful, but in a very traditional sense of just recommending resources. And when they began to work on a big project, she worked with her dissertation advisor on a large project, and they went to the library to try to get help. They wanted advice on how to obtain materials for what they were trying to do, and how to store it and manage it. And she said the libraries didn't express very much interest. They kept throwing up barriers. You can't do it because of this. You can't do it because of that. And so finally, in frustration, they found other experts on campus and from other departments, from the geography department. And that group of people actually that was the precursor of establishing a digital humanities center on the campus where she was. It was a UC campus, which I won't mention. And then eventually somebody was designated from the library to focus on digital humanities. And then she began to hear about other things, even just within UC, that hadn't been known to her. Things like e-scholarship, and that's in fact where she works now, in the Mark Twain Online project. So that little evolution of kind of resistance and then moving into a greater level of support. The science person said that in her experience, librarians kind of fall into two camps. One says, oh, this is hard. We don't know how to do it. There's not enough time. There's not enough money. And the second camp are those who are excited about doing something new. They love to learn about something new. They see it as an opportunity and a defining moment, her words, and they want to be seen as indispensable. So then I asked them, well, what would you like to see librarians doing? What should they be focusing on? And that was a little bit surprising to me in terms of how they weighted their responses. The humanities person said, well, someone who knows what's going on in digital humanities work in general, not just in UC, but beyond, and who can, in particular, help identify venues for where to publish work in the digital humanities. This is a big challenge right now. She mentioned the George Mason Center, the Dan Cohen work that has done a lot of things in support of digital humanities. And she said knowing about things like that, places like that, help with citing digital works, that's always a problem. You know, getting down into the components of a digital corpus was one thing she mentioned. She said that MLA, as the main professional society, is trying to address some of these things, but it's kind of slow going, and she felt that librarians could really assist in that conversation. The science person said, you just need a good marketing campaign. You need to be aggressive and build relationships, and don't wait for those graduate students to come to you, because they're not going to anymore. You know, you need to go out and be part of their team. And you don't always have to have the answer, but you have to know how to find it. Well, gosh, that sure sounds like what reference librarians are really comfortable with. And then I asked them, well, what kinds of skills or training do librarians need to be successful and credible in working with researchers on these kinds of areas? Again, the humanities person said, know what's going on in the discipline at large. Things move quickly. Sometimes changes come from unexpected places. So really just being that sort of scanner of what's happening in the field. She said that some technical expertise is useful, but it's basic knowledge of the web technology, of things like XML, how do facets function. So nothing too fancy, but just sort of a basic vocabulary. And then she talked about understanding how the old connects with the new and how to build on the old way of doing things in order to do some of the new work. As Tom said, things don't have to be transformative all in one big gulp, that there are incremental things that happen. So she felt that librarians were good partners in helping to scope that out. She said that in the humanities you have to be comfortable with the free-form nature of the humanities. That in literature in particular, scholars are used to getting rid of categories. They want interfaces that go against rigidity. They don't want things that are terribly structured. Whereas in history, they're more used to dealing with sort of these data points that lend themselves to structure. So that was sort of an interesting comment. And then she said, be open to possibilities, be open to rethinking, show some excitement. Healthy cynicism is okay, but be willing to move forward and kind of meet these challenges. And the science person said much of the same thing. She said have basic knowledge of some of the components of work in managing data, the types of software that scientists use in different fields, data standards, where are the repositories. She said just putting in a little effort to do some research could take you a long way. She said find a way to connect to their world, show that you know where they fit in. And what she meant by that is to kind of understand the network of connections and relationships in the field and be able to indicate that you know something about that, that if there's a research center somewhere and you meet somebody who studied there and you can tell them, oh, I have followed the work of that center, things like that. She said, go a long way. And then she said, don't be intimidated, that librarians really have a lot to offer and they have to have confidence. She mentioned the data management planning tool, which some of you may have heard. We worked with 6 or 7 other universities to develop last fall, and it's helping researchers respond to data management requirements from funding agencies. She said, this is a great way to get a foot in the door. You can say, I can help you set up an account, I can help you identify an appropriate repository for your data, and then you sort of go from there. So in just having these brief conversations with these 2 people, it kind of struck me that in the end, it's not our knowledge or lack of it that is the barrier to taking on these new roles. It's more our nature. And we need to kind of go back and tune into that part of us that loves to explore and to learn and be curious. And we all have that, or we wouldn't be in this profession. I think really being aware of your subject area, if you have that sort of role, and approach it just like the traditional way of learning about a discipline. Sources, this is what we learned in library school back in my day anyway, and it's much the same thing. Focusing on a larger scale of activity, I think, is also a theme that I see going through a lot of what is happening right now. At UC, we look at system-wide, but now we're looking at regional, national collaborations and activity, and even international developments. A lot of the major forces and things like open access and data management are coming from beyond the U.S. oftentimes. Focusing farther upstream in the process of managing information or in the research life cycle, and it's not just about working with published materials at the end of the cycle anymore. It's about getting involved at the beginning and also finding new ways of validating these new forms of scholarship. That's a really hot topic right now, that no one knows quite how to assess some of the output of these new fronts. And then going beyond silos, the traditional library silos of public services, technical services, and collections are just too limiting nowadays. And if you work within one of them, it's useful just to be able to step back and see how some of these issues flow through what the library does from the perspective of the researcher. Looking at interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary trends, again, that's where a lot of these new forms of scholarship are coming into play in those areas. That's where a lot of what we see in scholarship is coming from as well. And then another silo that you may have on your campus is, figuring out how to go beyond the library and work with other key units on campus. It may be IT or the Office of Research or some special research center. And then finally, just marketing, promoting your skills, being able to craft compelling and succinct messages about what you know, what you can do, what you offer, and then inserting those into the environments where the researchers are.
Thank you, Laine. Our next speaker is Clifford Lynch, who is an iSchool adjunct faculty at UC Berkeley. Clifford has led the Coalition for Networked Information since 1997. CNI is jointly sponsored by the Association of Research Libraries and EDUCAUSE. It includes about 200 member organizations concerned with the intelligent uses of information technology and networked information to enhance scholarship and intellectual life. CNI's wide-ranging agenda includes work in digital preservation, data-intensive scholarship, teaching, learning and technology, and infrastructure and standards development. Prior to joining CNI, Cliff spent 18 years at the University of California Office of the President, the last 10 as the Director of Library Automation. Cliff holds a PhD in computer science from UC Berkeley, and as I said, is an adjunct professor at the Berkeley School of Information. So please welcome Cliff.
Well, it's really nice to be here. I had prepared some pretty brief remarks because I thought we'd really want as much time as possible for conversation. They've been getting briefer as I've been sitting here. Laine in particular said a number of the things that I had hoped to point out, although much more coherently and eloquently perhaps than I would have been able to. I do want to make a few observations, very much building on some of what we've heard from Tom and from Laine to frame the discussion we're going to have. My perspective is a little funny here because I know something about what's going on at Berkeley. I am a very, very adjunct faculty member at the iSchool, but I do try and keep in touch with what's happening at the campus, and I have some pretty deep roots here of various kinds. I used to know quite a bit about what's going on in the UC system, which is a very complicated animal in its own way. Although I fear much of what I know is somewhat out of date at this point. On the other hand, one of the wonderful things about my position at the coalition is it gives me a pretty broad view into what's going on at major research institutions across the nation and even a little bit beyond there, and in particular some of the issues facing libraries and information technology groups as they try and adapt to the changing agendas at those research institutions. So I'll be drawing on all of those perspectives in my comments. So in terms of roles for libraries and librarianship, the agenda going forward, I think we can identify a few things that are very, very clear. For example, one is this issue that Laine referred to about data-intensive scholarship, both in the humanities and in the sciences, and a growing demand for more scrupulous management, more deliberate management of the data that is produced, and not just produced, but is critical to the conduct of that kind of science. It's produced, it's reused, it's recombined. This is going to continue to be a theme. It is worth noting that there are bigger contexts still around that. One is a sort of a very broad theme of openness, which you could see playing out in discussions about open access to governmentally funded research, both the data coming out of it and the reports of that research in the literature. Another piece of it that you may not have picked up on so clearly, but I think is really going to be emerging more and more seriously as a drumbeat over the next few years is reproducibility. There are some very strange things going on. One is that as we do scholarship that involves very, very complex software systems, large-scale computations, lots of data, where there's a tremendous pressure to publish in some fields, especially biomedical sciences, you're starting to see experiments that can't be reproduced. They can't be reproduced because assembling the same configuration of software and hardware 6 months later is impossible. Everything is a moving target. We're seeing some very, very disturbing studies suggesting that substantial numbers of experimental results that are documented in papers in our top journals can't be reproduced. There are people who are going through now systematically saying, you know, let's go pick a issue of the Journal of, I don't know, the American Psychological Association or something. Let's just try and reproduce all the results in there. And it's not going well in some cases. It's quite common in pharmaceutical companies when they start a new line of commercial research targeted to drug development that's based on a set of reports in the academic literature, to have their research group internally start out by trying to reproduce a number of the major results, both to get up to speed and get familiar with the techniques and cell lines and things like that as necessary. And they're finding that sometimes that doesn't work. That in fact they have to they have to abandon it because they just literally cannot reproduce those results reliably enough to build on. This is a sort of a slowly bubbling crisis that's showing up in a lot of different contexts, and it's going to put even more emphasis on documenting the record of research, both in terms of software and in terms of underlying data. So I think you can expect some broad trends to focus more on that. I'll mention a couple of other kind of broad areas. One is dealing with the sort of intense reallocations and in some cases disinvestments of funding that are happening now. In some ways, this is a very bad era for scholarship and for education, although I would say that's not uniform, and what's going on is actually quite complex. But I think we face lots of challenges about how to deal with critical problems in the face of insufficient funding. We face demands, I think, for collaboration, and especially interinstitutional collaboration, and the development of interinstitutional strategies that really take us beyond anything we've done before in response to this. I think we need to be very thoughtful in the face of these, because there's a certain amount of retrenching and devolution, to use the term Tom suggested, that's going on. And in some cases, we must do this, we need to do this, but it shouldn't stop us from making the case about why this is important and why it needs to be adequately funded as a basic investment that society needs to make. We need to go down both of those paths simultaneously. And that, I think, is going to be a very challenging balance.